Welcome to you all to this Pathways Forum on Decolonizing Sustainability Science. Sustainability science is often taken for granted as a virtuous way of applying some sort of neutral scientific knowledge and expertise to socio-environmental challenges. And what may seem like a project aiming for universal good rests on foundations tied to colonization and coloniality. Whether it be on the way science as a form of knowledge has been constructed and supported by powerful institutional structures, or on the way the concept of sustainability itself has been historically and politically framed, sustainability science is charged with colonial biases. Sometimes they're hidden, sometimes they're more overt, but they must be addressed and challenged in order to work on socially just transformations towards more desirable futures. And more desirable futures, not just from a global north perspective. So the idea today is to unpack a number of problematic aspects with sustainability science that pertain to coloniality. This is a dense topic, and I'm very grateful to our speakers today who will lead this discussion. I would like to give a warm welcome to Farhana Sultana from Syracuse University, to Lyla Mehta from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, and to Bagele Chilisa from the University of Botswana. To give you a brief overview of what's in store for us today as a session, we will divide this webinar into two parts. The first part will serve to introduce different aspects of the topic of decolonizing sustainability science through presentations from our speakers. So Farhana will start with a global and maybe more geopolitical perspective on climate coloniality. Then Lyla will talk about the TAPESTRY project as a concrete example on how to address colonial and Western biases in sustainability science. And to conclude the first part of the webinar, Bagele will talk about the importance of indigenous methodologies to challenge dominant epistemological paradigms and to convene radically alternative perspectives into sustainability science. After the presentations, there will be time for one or two clarifying questions, but please save your more deep questions for the discussion part, which will happen in the second half of the session. That will be dedicated to an open discussion where you will all be invited to contribute with questions, with your own reflections and comments, where you can share your experience and insights on decolonizing sustainability science. I think that I've talked much longer than I needed to. With this, it is time for me to invite our first speaker, Farhana Sultana, to take the floor. Farhana, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you so much, Gilles, for this generous introduction to the whole forum and for inviting me to speak with you at the Pathways Initiative. And thank you to everyone who's joining us from around the world, it seems. And my apologies if my voice is a bit croaky. I do have a cold, but hopefully it'll still be somewhat coherent. I want to talk about what we mean by sustainability science, but through a perspective of climate science, and at a scale that's not just planetary, but what that means. So in recent studies, climate scientists have warned that the safe operating space for humanity, or often known as planetary boundaries, that the planet provides us is shrinking. Environments around the world are recognized as being under grave threat of anthropogenic disruptions and destructions that go beyond repair and restoration. Collectively, these stressors and threat multipliers are associated with anthropogenic, ecological, biospheric, and climate destruction. So what we know that when we think about common pool resources like water, forestry, fisheries, and even clean air, there's been increasing breaches of what is loading or what can be possible to sustain it long term. This work by climate scientists has focused predominantly on global scale analyses and frameworks, looking at cumulative quantitative indicators of biophysical boundaries and limits that can be monitored without recourses to questions of equity. While these are useful tools for understanding and addressing global environmental challenges, they do not address the uneven responsibilities or vulnerabilities that challenge the fairness and effectiveness of global environmental governance. It therefore raises the questions of who gets to set these boundaries? Whose interests do they serve? How are the burdens historically shared? How did we get here? These issues are particularly pertinent given the historical marginalization of Global South voices in international environmental and climate negotiations. Critiques of frequent discourses of we and humanity in planetary perspectives of the Anthropocene have been raised across disciplines because structural inequities and causation drivers are hardly theorized or focused upon. There is no undifferentiated humanity in an increasingly fractured world. What emerging areas of scholarship has sought to promote is a justice perspective to look at how access to resources and sustainability of systems that underpin that access thrive or are needing to change. This brings us to questions around equity, not just from the impacts, but the shared responsibilities surrounding the geopolitics of planetary environmental injustices. The unevenness of the outcomes associated with pursuing resource-based economic growth and biospheric exploitation have had far-reaching consequences for centuries, both in terms of who benefits, but also where, and furthermore, how. The global crossing of these planetary boundaries is not the same everywhere or contributed equally by everyone. There are equity and justice considerations, such as responsibility, impacts, and shared burdening. Indeed, any discussion on sustainability or planetary and ecological limits or availability of planetary resources is entirely a political question, and it requires not only planetary analysis, but regional and local, and recognizing those local global interconnections and how they should be investigated. Climate and ecological breakdown results largely from extraction, overproduction, overconsumption, and waste disposal that are very unevenly and inequitably distributed around the planet, mainly because of historical factors that produced the colonial capitalist system of unjust economic growth models, geopolitical control, and the epistemic injustice of the notions of prosperity. So first of all, we can start to think about, well, what's driving this? We know intuitively, or largely from media, that the capitalist elite everywhere are rather over-consuming and leading this charge, not only to colonize the global ecological, biospheric, and atmospheric resources, but colonizing minds into what is desirable. What should one look like to be a modern citizen on this planet, or a good global citizen who consumes? These models of hyperconsumption, extractivism, and a discard culture of increasing waste production tends to discount and throw away all that is actually needed to sustain ourselves, other species, and the planet itself. What we know is that global elites participate in what is known as an accumulation by dispossession, resulting not only in disproportionate capitalist benefits from resource control and promotion of neocolonialist policies with outsized influence, but they continue to contribute to various types of ecological harms, biodiversity crises, water pollution, air pollution, and largely fueling the planetary climate crisis that we're seeing. But they do not experience the impacts every day firsthand all the time. The boundaries that are being crossed and being studied by climate scientists are also showing us that perhaps we need to think about regional issues. So how do these capital elites everywhere, but then also specific countries, primarily high energy industrialized economies of the global north, tend to cause disproportionate social and ecological harms to more marginalized communities, often elsewhere, but also internally within their borders? The extraction and discard culture embedded in the geopolitical processes and economic models not just include natural resource exploitation, but the destruction of human lives and potentials, resulting in a discard for the care economy and resilience of ecosystems, often providing just lip service to basic welfare of billions caught up in exploitative and neocolonial labor relations with global capital and extractive resource-based trade that cause irreversible harms. But what do we know about what's happening in the countries that are highly overconsumptive? We know that the average citizen does not necessarily feel that way. They feel that they are locked into systems of energy use via infrastructure, transportation, and agricultural modes of production that they feel are outside of their control. But this is not entirely true because regulatory changes, cultural shifts, and policy changes can occur. A better understanding of the wider political economy that holds climate justice, global societal equity, and sufficiency and commoning at the heart perhaps can enable larger numbers of people to foster change and promote the systemic and structural shifts that are needed to even discuss what we mean by sustainability. One way that some scholars around the global north and elsewhere, but drawing largely from scholarship, indigenous communities in the global south, have been arguing is to confront these endless growth and extractive models. We need to think about those connections. We need to reduce the materials throughput. We need to think about the decision making because the worlds we inhabit did not just appear. This is not gravity. It was made to happen through particular formations of colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and Eurocentric science models of just the last few centuries. It is now a destructive fossil fuel-based growth paradigm, the bill which has been historically paid by ecosystems and communities of Black, Brown, and Indigenous societies across the global South, such as Asia, Africa, Latin America, but increasingly globally everywhere. So when we think about the majority world, or the world that was historically colonized and exploited, what is also contradictory is citizens there are increasingly being encouraged to aspire to hyperconsumption, whereby material goods and high energy usage have limited the terms of the debate on what well-being can mean beyond the pursuit of ever higher GDP growth rates. Of course, there's absolutely no doubt that having sufficient water, food, housing, education, employment, healthcare, and leisure are critically essential and just, yet often are impossible because entirely from that global maldistribution of resources and power relations that are leading to planetary boundaries being breached. What we're seeing is with international development institutions and globalization models, as well as media, pop culture, and influencer culture, more and more countries, communities, and people across the entire world are being aspirational to mimic unsustainable Eurocentric or Western high-intensive capitalist lifestyles and mindsets that only fuel further resource overconsumption and production of waste that is often outside the purview of everyday discussions. But the ideologies that are driving this, that we have normalized, often go against indigenous and local cultural practices of sufficiency, care, commoning, sustainability, reciprocity, and welfare, because they have historically been eroded and continue to be devalued. Eurocentric colonial capitalist renditions of modernity and coloniality that involve the present day manifestations of high energy desires and the pursuit of highly ever destructive GDP growth is a model that was built through Industrial Revolution, but it was largely established post-World War II. And what has become norm or become geopolitically seems impossible also means that the speed of mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the global north, but now everywhere, has not kept up in order to maintain planetary justice at all. So we have these bifurcated problems, both an unawareness of the crisis, but at the same time outside the field of vision of what that crisis means. But we know that increasing losses and damages in real time are occurring as the externalities of capitalist growth are increasingly exported to more and more marginalized communities and groups of people rendered to be in sacrifice zones. At the same time, we know that the remaining biophysical and planetary resources globally are not always available to everyone spatially and societally for even basic well-being. What we know as the colonization of the atmosphere and biospheric resources skew what is available and accessible to the have-nots. The justice implications are naturally extensive and enduring, because when we know that there's an unequal ecological exchange across regions and countries and communities that drain not just resources that are material and economic, but it tends to structure the world economy that relies on that continual exploitation of resources, production of sacrifice zones, and increasing marginalization of various communities while holding out the hope of ever increasing development and prosperity. What we're seeing is this ongoing colonial plunder of resources across communities, but at the same time, those colonial patterns of harm and dispossession tend to continue from the past and into the future, with increasing debt burdens of poorer countries and communities, and which results in the funneling up of benefits to the few, whether it's through trade, education, business models. There's a kind of an ecosystem of epistemological and material realities that render multiply vulnerable people disproportionately open to further harms, while at the same time changing what that tapestry looks like. As societies extract, produce, transport, consume, and dispose at greater quantities and at ever greater speeds, it is impossible to expect the system will not buckle or shift in unforeseen ways. But we know at the same time that the discussion around intergenerational justice has become huge in places like the US and elsewhere, but intragenerational and spatial, even going back to the past and stretching across the globe, are not necessarily reaching the conversations as much as they could have in the last 20 years of the UNFCCC meetings. What scholars and activists have been calling for is an ecological justice and a true decolonization and abolition justice that occurs everywhere. This would allow for greater investments in basic human rights and disrupt that perverse discursive and economic colonization that fetishizes growth, commodification, hyper-consumption, and discard culture and policies that lead to boundary crossings. So I want to conclude by saying that any discussion around sustainability needs to reckon more critically with the unequal contributions to scalar, biospheric, and atmospheric crises and the political economy of that, as well as the uneven impacts, consequences, and responsibilities. It needs to reckon with also how we can discursively and materially foster other notions of well-being and prosperity beyond destructive growth models, because whose planetary boundaries are we actually breaching, and who can claim it was theirs to begin with? What we require, therefore, are more practical and equitable alliances and real solidarities with social movements across the world, from which lessons can be learned, trialed, unlearned, and relearned. As feminist, decolonial, anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-imperial scholars and activists have demonstrated for years, such analysis must also contend with the intersectional impacts and outcomes, as well as the alternative modes of flourishing that exist but are often unheeded or discarded. This includes attention to intersections of gender, race, class, ethnicity, indigeneity, and other axes of social oppression, and the ways in which the epistemologies and praxis of well-being and prosperity occur on the ground. And this is where I argue that feminist, decolonial, and justice scholars who stress the importance of care, respect, mutuality, relationality, and multi-species justice are tending to the root causes of unequal power relations and marginalizations, but trying to figure out how to address it. To achieve meaningful and equitable and impactful outcomes, we must ally with those who are doing the work on the ground, but may not be as powerful as the ones who are always in front of us. Otherwise, any discussions on planetary limits and boundaries, or any discussions of economic growth, will maintain the crisis of climate coloniality. What we know is that dangerously strained ecological, biospheric, and atmospheric boundaries largely stem from lack of democracy in economic organization and planning, institutional policy priorities, and geopolitical power relations. But it is also one of ontological and epistemological shifts that are necessary at scale to include different visions and models that prioritize futures not based on colonial and imperial utopias of endless capitalist, technocentric economic growth that results in ecosystem collapse, but one that focuses on that restoration and reparation and regeneration, kinship and dignity and flourishing for all. We know that this planetary crisis is a colonial capitalist product, and decolonizing the current system is not just about having a seat at some mythical table, but burning the table down and a fundamental reformulation of paradigms and solidarities and knowledge bases that are rooted in justice and meaningful praxis for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Farhana. Thanks a lot for setting the terms of the discussion so clearly and powerfully. I want to see if there are any clarifying questions about what Farhana just shared with us. Once again, if you have more substantial questions, feel free to write them in the chat or save them for later during the discussion, but we will deal with the bigger questions in the second part of the webinar. But for now, if you have clarifying questions, please feel free to ask. Like I said, it was very clear. So, and maybe it takes a little while to process all these things. So, if there are no questions at this time, I suggest that we continue forward with our second presentation from Lyla Mehta. Lyla, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Hi, can you see me okay and hear me?
We can see you, hear you, and we can see your slide as well.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I thank Jill and colleagues from the Pathways Forum and Future Earth for inviting me to speak in this very exciting webinar. And it's also a pleasure to be on the panel with Bagele and Farhana. And Farhana, thanks for kicking us off so eloquently. I completely agree with the need to unpack those boundaries, what they mean, look at them historically, what they mean for whom, etc. So I'm going to carry on with that theme. I'm going to look at how we address coloniality, decoloniality, and sustainability policies and practices and ways of viewing nature-society relations, also taking that historical perspective that Farhana started us on. So I was asked to talk a lot about the Tapestry project, so I'm going to do that, but I'm going to top and tail it with some other more general reflections. The Tapestry project is Transformations as Praxis, exploring socially just and transdisciplinary pathways to sustainability in marginal environments. It was an amazing project. It concluded last year. A lot of the time was lost in the pandemic, though we did a lot of work, notwithstanding. It was just when we were getting going that we had to stop. It was funded by the ISC, Belmont, North Face, so you can see all the funders there. And it was part of the Transformations to Sustainability program. It worked in India and Bangladesh, but we worked across several countries, including these two countries, plus Norway, Japan, and the UK. And my presentation, I'm the presenter. I'm going to be the storyteller, but I owe this presentation to all the names up there and many, many more. So it was very much collaborative work across different institutions, across different countries. And a big part of what we did was co-producing work, looking at it in an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary way, working across local communities, academics, practitioners, and disciplines. Very challenging at times, but still, I think, very, very rewarding too. And of course, a lot of contradictions that we can also discuss. So what I'm going to talk about now is the contested notion of sustainability and how it is rooted in coloniality. Examples of how we can challenge post-colonial and Western biases in sustainability sciences, drawing on the Tapestry project, and starting to give some ways forward and how to decolonize practices in terms of how we work. So, Farhana said, whose boundaries? So I can start off by saying, whose sustainability? The definition of sustainability refers to the ability to maintain or support a system over time. And it's linked to three pillars: economic, environmental, and social, or sort of people, planet, profit. But how do we juggle these trade-offs? Whose interests count? All this is intensely political. So if you see this landscape here, to some people, it would be very barren, empty. It's got these few camels there and one lonely herder. And it's eyed by developers. But for these people here, the herder, this is a very productive land. This is the home. This is linked to their identity, to these very special camel, the Karai camel, the swimming camel, the only very few swimming camels in the world. And some of them are in this region. So these camels can be on land and they also swim to their mangroves. But the interests of these herders and their camels have largely been silenced and marginalized in the interest of dominant science and business interests, and often these collude. So it may seem that sustainability sciences are neutral ways of studying and describing the relationship between humans and nature and non-humans, but in fact, they're deeply shaped by legacies of colonization and coloniality, patterns of thinking, institutional structures, as well as flows of money and resources. And these started from the times of colonies and empires. So in reality, these sciences are full of hidden biases, poorly equipped to deal with rich and diverse knowledges of people in different settings around the world. And these often perpetuate racialized, gender, and colonial legacies. So we also heard from Farhana right now, the science is so uncertain. The science is so uneven around at the planetary scale. It's not location specific. It ignores many of these uneven processes and how they play out, and certainly blind to issues of intersectional justice, racial justice, gender justice, etc. So the term sustainability was first coined in an environmental context in the 18th century by a German forester, von Karlowitz, to prescribe how forests should be managed on a long-term basis. And this early emphasis on conserving economically valuable natural resources remained a key thread in environmental policies that emerged amidst periods of imperial and colonial expansion, and also their consolidation in colonial and post-colonial and contemporary environmental policies and practices. So a lot of the policies and practices were geared to economic profit for European powers and colonial states. And they often focused on rapid exploitation of natural resources in most parts of what we now know as the global south or the majority world. And the social consequences were devastating, accompanied by slavery, racialized discrimination, and the grabbing of lands, livelihoods, etc. from local women and men with exploitative and degrading labor practices. But this carries on even today. Colonial environmentalism includes another parallel desire, the aesthetic and moral urge to preserve an imagined pristine nature and wilderness in the tropics. So you have this emergence of this white savior kind of complex, a perpetuation of fortress conservation. So, Prince William has been quite criticized recently in terms of his conservation efforts. For one, often including only non-African perspectives on conservation, perpetuating this white savior kind of stereotype, also drawing on very problematic neo-Malthusian notions. For example, Africa's rapidly growing population burdens wildlife and the environment. So in short, Black, brown, and marginalized people are blamed for overpopulation and consequently sort of environmental demise. So this is played out. This is one example, but you see this all across. And to this day, environmental conservation and sustainability policies tend to label local people and their practices often as primitive or environmental destroyers, justifying their removal, restriction, or re-education. So here, for example, a lot of the herders and camels and the pastoralism in this part of Western India, in Kutch, and I'll talk about that in a minute, are seen to be the main cause for the destruction of this very thick mangrove belt. And mangroves are really very important. They're very important for biodiversity and also carbon sinking. But very little is focusing on the role of industry, for example, and what they're doing. So common lands have been privatized, parceled up, and a lot of these pastoralists have been discouraged or prevented from freely moving with their herds and accessing their own resources. Feminist scholars such as Anna Singh and Donna Haraway have shown through the concept of the plantationist scene, the colonial era was marked by the creation of scientifically managed plantations of certain crops, i.e. timber and rubber. And these unsustainable monocultures undermined biodiversity, supported slavery and indentured labor, patriarchal supremacy, and involved dispossession, and even worse, atrocities against so many non-white people. So these borders and leaders have changed, but these so-called sustainable development projects continue to dispossess people of rights and livelihoods all around. Present-day justifications are different. However, modern projects are carried out in the name of green energy and climate mitigation, including solar parks and wind farms that you see here. And this is also a form of mitigation. So let me talk very briefly now about the TAPESTRY project. We're looking at transformations to sustainability from below in marginal environments characterized by climate uncertainties, but also other pathways of change. We're looking at 3 patches or areas. So one is dryland Kutch that I just spoke about, where we're focusing on herders, camel herders, looking at how we can preserve local breeds, come up with alternative livelihoods, and also challenge negative perceptions of pastoralism. We're looking at the big city, Mumbai, mangrove restoration here, and also looking at fishing livelihoods. And finally, we're looking at the Sundarbans in both India and Bangladesh in a transboundary perspective. And in all these places, you have this intersection, not just of climate change and uncertainty, but also dominant development and capitalist trajectory. So they all come together to increase the kind of uncertainties of local people and local communities. So our focus is we're looking at bottom-up transformation in marginal environments characterized by climate uncertainty. And we ask if uncertainty can be an opportunity for change, for bottom-up change and transformation. And one critical thing that we're doing is challenging top-down valuations and framings of these environments, including the science around sustainability. So these so-called marginal environments like deltas, drylands, wetlands are characterized by events such as floods, droughts, cyclones. And they're often stereotyped by terms such as unproductive, on the edge, etc. And they often seem to be very different and away from the norm and the normal. So we're kind of challenging this valuation. We're reframing what counts as marginal and marginal environments. And we're doing this in every patch. And here we're looking at alliances or networks within specific geographical locations and sites where relations of power and knowledge are reconfigured. So our concept of transformation looks at praxis, and Farhana mentioned it too. It's a reflective process involving critique of existing social arrangements and a search for alternatives, very much a focus on agency and bottom-up change, and also looking at different alliances. So the notion of co-production is really important, but co-production, not just to bring different people together, but to create new kind of social orders. So to do this, you really need to bring together different methodological approaches. So really working with locally based partners, a long durée perspective, ethnography and in-depth fieldwork. It was difficult in the pandemic. Arts-based approaches, archival work, digital ethnography. We brought together social and natural sciences. And I guess the local perspective was always a starting point in framing our research. So I'll give you a few examples of what we did. Now, this is the maximum city, Bombay, Mumbai, one of India's largest densely populated cities, very flood prone and very, very prone to sea level rise, highly vulnerable to climate change. We focused here on the coolies, the traditional fisher folk living in urban villages. Despite the climate risks in this city, and they're very well known, there's massive infrastructure, coastal development, and even the IPCC call this maldevelopment, but it's still continuing. And all that is impinging a lot on the local livelihoods of the fishers. Here we focus on Versova Kolivada, a long history being the indigenous peoples of this city. Their main occupation is fishing, but it has really shifted due to pressures. It's become very, very difficult to carry on fishing, not just because of climate change, but because of ecological deterioration, development pressure, and different aspirations. So there's a grave loss of livelihood and economies. So working together with Bombay 61, we were really trying to look at how we can reimagine urban planning. So one was obviously resisting these commercial developments, but also bringing together citizens, scientists, and state agencies, addressing inequalities in these areas, but also trying to look at different ways of governance, different ways of mapping, and the role of technology and alternative forms of planning to create new transformations. So mangroves are really important, even in this site, in all our sites, mangroves are really important. And for the fishers, they're treasured as spawning ground for fish, they're protective buffer against floods. But for many developers, they're of course impediments of financial opportunity. So we did different types of mapping, looking at different ways to understand pollution, vegetation, biodiversity, looking at the commons, these creeks as commons, even these so-called rivers that are drains, trying to reimagine them in different ways. And here the data can be a rich source or tool for the community to put forth issues to the authorities and initiate alternative forms of urban planning. Now here, drawing on indigenous knowledge from one of the fishers, nets were used to try and trap plastic in the creek, and this was co-produced together with scientists, and it was a big hit. I mean, it was covered widely in the media, and now we're waiting for some state agency to actually help roll this out.
Leave in Grenville Road 5.
Sorry, is that everything okay?
Everything is fine, Lyla. I think so.
Okay, all right. So let's move now to one more example. This is Western India in Kutch. It's a dryland district that's witnessed a lot of ecological, economic, and demographic change in the last decades, especially after the 2001 earthquake. Before that, it was a very sleepy, so-called backwater when I first went there for my PhD, but now it's changed drastically. Aggressive industrialization, a boom in business activities. All India's major corporate houses are there, special economic zones, etc. So you can imagine what all this means for rural communities living along the coast, especially. And in particular, what does this mean for fishers, for herders, for farmers? So we focused on these camel herders. I've already said a little about them. We were looking ethnographically at the synergistic links between the mangroves, the camels, and the herders, the Maldharis, and also exploring different types of alternative livelihoods, some of the intergenerational and intersectional challenges, and also different forms of adaptation. And what came out really strongly was the opposition of the herders to the narratives of camels being harmful to the mangroves. And this was the dominant narrative by the scientists. Very, very strong narrative, and we really tried to challenge that. So we did that through different forms of co-production. One was integrating indigenous knowledge with scientific protocols, even drawing on visual art, for example. And I'll just talk a little about this. This was done by Professor Nobu Onte in Kyoto University. They did a lot of GIS and mapping and Landsat data, and they looked at it over time. And I think what emerged there was that there was no significant change in the mangrove vegetation cover at all. And if at all, the areas that were being grazed, biodiversity had enhanced there. So this work is being published right now. And this work was done together with the Camel Breeders Association, with Sarjeevan, with other local actors in the district. And really, this is a really good example of how you can bring together natural science, local people, community science, etc., to really challenge some of these dominant narratives around sustainability or unsustainability. So I'm just going to wrap up with showing a few ways in which, using participatory arts and visuals can also lift some of these invisible perspectives or perspectives that don't come to the fore. And they're particularly important for women and youth who are not often consulted in formal fora. And so the aim here was to focus on vivencia or lived experiences representing people's own understandings of climate change, uncertainty, and transformation. So visual ethnography, digital art, photo voice, all these were really, really important. And these stories were taken to metropolitan elites, to policymakers through exhibitions, etc. So photo voice, many of you are probably familiar with it. Different stories are told, and it really offers silenced and marginalized people a voice. And, you can see really interesting stories that come up. With Dr. Anandita Saha and Vinita Damodaran, we worked in the Sundarbans with children in the height of the pandemic, asking them to paint, and these paintings voiced experiences on living with climate change and its impact. So these were, again, youth. The voice of youth is often missing. So these paintings have been exhibited in Kolkata. They've been shown to policymakers, and again, lift these kind of lived experiences. And finally, bringing different groups together through these roundtables in terms of really trying to look and address the politics of translating and communicating uncertainty. So here, can we think about hybrid knowledges, ways to bridge gaps between science and policy, and also local perspectives? So how do we seek out these multiple perspectives and also explore ways to foster socially just and inclusive pathways of development? So, there are lots of challenges in what we did, and one can pick a lot of holes, but I guess it was an attempt to try and address epistemic, environmental, and social and gender injustice, and also focus on some of the root causes of vulnerability. We clearly took a very normative approach to sustainability, as Gilles said, and also focusing on place-based knowledge and place-based understanding. And the research was studying change, but also trying to be part of the change. And here, a huge emphasis was on co-production in terms of challenging and trying to break down inequitable power relations. Now, you really need to be very reflexive about this, and there are obviously ethical dilemmas in everything that we did, and we can discuss that further. But, obviously nothing is a smooth process. There's dangers that transformation can be apolitical and not really, we don't address the messy and fraught nature, as well as, the questions of who has agency, whose voice is heard, etc. So how can we decolonize current practices? I think I've tried to highlight the need to lift hidden and invisible perspectives, and I've outlined a few methodological approaches to do that in ways to address how we can address the problems that are missed in scientific framings shaped by Western worldviews. So this means seeking multiple perspectives, hybrid perspectives, and striving for cognitive and epistemic justice. It means pushing back against destructive and exploitative practices, and also the myths around these issues, that perpetuate and continue to colonize nature and people. So perpetuate these notions that certain livelihoods and lives are unproductive, destructive, etc. It also means challenging indices, tools, and methods. So for example, these tools are not neutral. They reflect worldviews of their creators. This was said by Rakina and Brockington. So indices such as environmental performance index, ecological footprint, what do all these mean? How can we challenge them? Are they hiding certain injustices and ecological distributional effects? It also means challenging invisible white biases and invisible elite biases of people like myself, people of color, questions of caste, class, indigeneity, things that may not come to the fore. Radically challenging the way we work and operate, who is framing the agendas, who is funding us, how do ideas flow? They shouldn't just flow from global north to south, how do we change that? And how do we perpetuate and stop perpetuating these unequal ways of doing science and research? So I guess this calls for sort of new forms of embracing diversity, asking who speaks, who listens, who convenes, whose perspectives count, and questioning coloniality in oneself, and also in everyday life, and how one's own behavior can contribute to coloniality in the world. And it doesn't have to be Western, it also within global South context. So how can we be more reflexive, deep listening, and also fighting some of these biases? So I think I'll stop now, and we can pick up on these questions later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lyla. Sorry, I forgot to give you the 3-minute reminder, but I was so absorbed by your presentation. And plus, you finished right on time, so it was no need for it.
Okay, great.
We have a few questions for you in the chat. Some of them we'll deal with in the discussion part because they're quite deep questions. Others I think we can take now. Michael had an interesting question about the impact of camels that you talked about in your presentation. I don't know, Michael, if you would like to take the floor to reformulate the question, maybe.
Sure, thank you. Michael Kern from Organic Agricultural Research Institute in Switzerland. Very fascinating work. The narrative, my interest is where the narrative comes from. If the evidence base, even the natural science evidence base, which you showed, for camels having a negative impact on mangroves, where does the narrative come from if the evidence base is in fact so weak that a single study or whatever research you did clearly show that wasn't the case?
Well, the power of narratives and myths, right? So I guess there may be some studies, they have been doing studies there, and there are others here in this audience who also have worked in this region. So please do speak up if you do want to. There's a very strong narrative about pastoralists destroying the grazing lands, the commons, this idea of the commons, harding, etc. And a lot of the scientists, actually, some of them who are in this area, get their funding also from the big industry. So when they do environmental impact assessment, they often exonerate the industry and they have to find someone to blame. So often they blame the herders. Now, this study that we did here, it's not been published as yet. It will be, it's under review. And it's emerging evidence. So I think most of the dominant narrative is about harm. And you see that across the board. Anybody working on pastoralism will know what I'm talking about.
Thanks, Lyla.
I see there are lots of comments here.
Yes, another question that I think we can take now is one from Kenneth about the futuristic dimension of children's arts. That you mentioned the use of children's arts. Kenneth, maybe if you are able to take the floor, maybe you can expand on what you would like to ask.
Okay, thank you so much, Gilles, and thank you, Professor Mehta. Yeah, I was wondering because I found that quite interesting as one of the multiple approaches that you use, the artistic one. So could you speak a little bit more to it, like were the children only focusing on the reality on the ground, the now and the present, or were they also maybe prompted to think about alternative futures of the places that you worked on?
Thank you. So the children's artwork was done in the Sundarbans by Anandita Saha, Vinita Damodaran, and by other colleagues. And the children focused on their current problems, but they also looked at the future and what they wanted. And if any of you have done any of this work, you'll find that often things that come up are very immediate, but also, where they want to be. And so their visions, and often it's their livelihood. So most of them found that their livelihoods were unviable. So they really wanted a more secure life for themselves. And I guess it is powerful because it's youth voices, and then you take it to policymakers, and it's only 100 kilometers from Calcutta, right? Amit Tanshu, or 150 kilometers. I see Amit here. But it's a different world, basically. It's like day and night. So they just don't know how people live on these islands. So I think in that sense, it's really powerful.
Thank you.
It's metropolitan India, so disconnected from what's going on, just a few 100 kilometers away.
Wow. Thank you.
Thanks, Lyla. So one last question that I think can be addressed rather quickly. Is a question from Mayra asking, what is the difference between place-based knowledge and local knowledge?
Well, I guess they're quite similar, a lot of overlaps, but for me, maybe place-based is, I guess it highlights the importance of locating it within the particular place where you're living and links to identity, culture, etc. And we tend to dismiss that a lot, but it's really important because each of these places have histories, they have cosmologies, they're ontologically linked, etc. So it's a very place-based, local, place-based knowledge linked to where that particular locality.
Thanks for clarifying. So,
but I'm sure somebody else has a more eloquent answer than what I've just given.
I think with this, we're gonna have to move on to the last presentation from Bagele. For those of you who have asked questions in the chat, we will have time to go back to your questions during the discussion. But for now, I would like to convene Bagele to the virtual stand for a presentation on indigenous methodologies. Bagele, the floor is yours whenever you want.
It's afternoon down here in Botswana, so good afternoon, and if it's morning there, good morning. It's such a pleasure to be in this session today. I want to thank very much the first and the second speakers for their eloquent presentations. They've made my work very easy because in the process of discussing their topics, they did touch on methodologies.
Bagele, sorry to interrupt, Bagele. I'm not sure if it's intentional or not, but your camera is off.
My camera is off. Okay.
It was briefly on and it's off again. And
is that fine?
Yes, we can see you now.
Okay, so my topic today is the importance of indigenous methodologies. I want to rephrase it and say the importance of indigenous paradigms. And I want to emphasize the fact that we do not go very far in terms of talking about multiple methodologies, but we go deeper when we talk about multiple paradigms. So today I'm going to say to you that today's biggest conflict is between us human beings and also between us human beings and our environments. When you see a study where there were more than 10 participants or 10 researchers, the first question that you ask yourself is, whose voice was heard? These people, 10 researchers, obviously they must have multiple perspectives on whatever topic that may be the subject of research. You see multiple participants. For example, the fishermen, and you ask yourself, whose knowledge dominated the research? And you ask yourself, whose questions were being addressed? Were these researcher-centric questions coined to suit the funder? Or were these genuine research questions addressing relevant to the people's immediate challenges with the environment. Those are the questions that we ask when we talk indigenous paradigms and indigenous research paradigms. When we talk of indigenous paradigms, today we think of the conflict between human beings and the environment. And the question we ask is, do the paradigms that we use to do research, do they touch on the conflict that the people have with the environment? Do we treat the environment like talking beings? Does the environment have the right to talk? Do we listen to the environment? Or we dictate to the environment what we think we need to know and what we think we need to do? Do the current research paradigms bring in the environment, or the environment is just there to be acted on? So when we talk of indigenous research paradigms, we are trying to say, how can we coexist peacefully and in harmony with the environment? We are saying, how can we do our research such that we also think of the environment as a person that has a voice? What do indigenous paradigms bring to the research that is not there currently? I want to say that today's world is dominated by social science research paradigms that arise out of the histories, the philosophies, the experiences of the Euro-Western world. And that those methodologies and those paradigms are indigenous to Europe and the rest of the Western world. So when we talk indigenous research, we have to first of all to ask ourselves, what are the philosophies? What are the histories? What are the experiences? What are the cultures that drive the research? If you talk indigenous research methodologies, you first of all have to ask yourself whether you are doing your research grounded in an indigenous paradigm, grounded in the ways that those people that you do research on see reality. After all, when you do research, we are talking realities, and the issue is whose reality? How do those people that you do research on, how do they perceive reality? How do they perceive knowledge? What is knowledge to them? And what values drive how they do things, how they get along on their daily basis? As I said, our task today is to decolonize social science research so that our experiences are not only constructed through Western hegemony and ideology. So what strategies do you have when you say you are doing work with local people and you are bringing indigenous knowledge? What strategy do you have to ensure that your methodology is driven by the worldviews of those people? I may do photo voice, but okay, it's a good tool, but to what extent is it embedded in the culture, experiences, histories, worldviews of those people? Today, the world is dominated by 4 paradigms. The post-positivist, whose emphasis is just on one reality. There's only one reality that is known within a certain probability. And knowledge is knowledge if it can be empirically proven. If you can measure it, it doesn't exist. That is post-positivism. And culture doesn't get into it. No values. Research is value-free. You go to the interpretivist, they try to bring in some issues of diversity by saying that reality, there are multiple realities, and that knowledge is subjective. But even after they said that, how come indigenous knowledge is not part of the research that is done? I schooled in the US, not at once did I ever come across a text that invoked indigenous knowledge from Africa to inform research. Of course, the transformative research, whose emphasis is on social justice, and it appreciates the fact that research is political. There's a lot of power, and that what we see and what we read is really a question of who has more power. And of course, we have the pragmatic, which talk more of problem solving. Research is about problem solving. How you go about solving the problem. It is assumed that the tools are neutral, and therefore they do not have an ideological perspective that may influence how you solve the problem. So I'm here to say that it's time to pick up indigenous research paradigms. And I am here to say that in addition to the 4 paradigms, the post-positivist, the interpretivist, the transformative, the pragmatic, there is a 5th paradigm. And that paradigm, it is a paradigm that sums up some of the common understanding of what reality means, ontology, the nature of reality, what it means to know, epistemology, the nature of knowledge, and values, axiology. So I am here to say that there is a new paradigm on the block and that comes under the umbrella of indigenous paradigms. And so, how is it different? And so, how does it bring in the environment? I'll take an example of an indigenous paradigm from Africa. And I'm saying that this post-colonial indigenous paradigm from Africa, it sees reality as relational. With this paradigm, the whole process of research is about building relationships. And it is based on the philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because we are. And this we are does not only mean human beings, but it also includes the living and the non-living, the plants, the environment. I am because we are. Such an outlook on relational existence, coexistence, it brings us to think deeply about how we connect with one another as researchers. Researchers doing research, researchers doing research with participants, among participants, co-producing knowledge, researchers dealing with funders. All those power dynamics are addressed through the philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because we are. Another common thread that runs through indigenous paradigms is spirituality. I know the West do not like to speak about spirituality, but when we say spirituality, we are saying that our environment is sacred and human beings are sacred human beings. And when we see the environment as sacred, we therefore respect the environment. And we find strategies to research the environment in ways that also respect the environment, in ways that also listen to the environment. When you talk indigenous paradigms and other common characteristics or common attributes have to do with ethics, the way we do research. We cannot talk decolonization and not talk about the unethical ways in which we do our research. How much of the indigenous culture did you bring into the research when you carry out your research? How much, we talk of the nine R's, and this extend from representation to reciprocity to responsivity, and so on and so on. And of course, an addition of decolonization. We cannot talk decolonization without actually talking about ethics, rights, representation. reciprocity, responsibility. What are our responsibilities when we do research? What are we giving back to the communities? For how long do you continue to connect with the participants or the communities where you did research? Are we still running helicopter research where you zoom in and zoom out after you've collected your data, never to see those fishermen again? Or are we connecting and remain connected? Ubuntu requires connection, building relationships. When you do research, you build relationships. And this should be relationships that last. Relationships that benefit the community. I want to conclude by saying that when we talk decolonizing sustainability science, and we're talking of making sure that the research we do is relevant. When we talk methodologies, we don't talk methodologies, we talk multiple paradigms. And when you do research in the formerly colonized, the oppressed communities, those whose voices have been marginalized, when you do research there, today, I say, you invite, today I say that indigenous paradigms, they invite the dominant paradigms to a dense concert. They should interact, dance, and find solutions to problems until there is that interaction of paradigms where the indigenous paradigms are invited to interact and take the dance floor, with whichever paradigm. Research remains colonized. We are still being colonized, and we know it. That says Smith. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bagele, for this really thought-provoking speech. And yeah, I must say that I'm quite touched and excited about that convening of different paradigms to engage with one another, to dance with one another, as you explained. And thank you for reframing from methodologies to paradigms. I think this was a necessary shift to get the message across. Do we have clarifying questions? I'm sure lots, but we also now have time for discussion. I just would like to know if there are any quick questions that that Bagele can answer to before we move on to an open discussion. I see there were a lot of enthusiastic also comments on the mention of Ubuntu. Right. There doesn't seem to be any quick questions that can be answered to, which is probably a good sign. It means that we have now to engage into with the thick of it. So I suggest that we move to the discussion part of the webinar, convening everyone to voice their opinion, their questions, to engage with the speakers as well. And for this part, my colleague Stephanie O'Toole will take over in facilitating the discussion. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gilles, and thank you to the speakers as well for your introductions to the very important and genuinely amazing and unnecessary work and research that you do. So I have one question that I'm going to propose to you three before everyone else can take the floor. So for my question, I wanted to talk about activism and I wanted to talk about power as well. And as has been mentioned by our speakers before in their introductions, it's important to recognize the power associated with Western science, especially in academic institutions, and the need to challenge and change ideas about what constitutes real and true knowledge in academia, and paying attention to the relationships between power and knowledge means recognizing that academic institutions, including research organizations and universities, have historically been structured to favor Western scientific paradigms. So I suppose paying attention to power means recognizing that, for example, the knowledge system that we have represents a complex system, and that complex systems are characterized by many embedded powerful interests, which are not very much conducive to change, as we know. So I wanted to ask the question about activism, because I know that for some, the decolonization of knowledge has been criticized as a intellectual project rather than a political project. So the process of decolonizing sustainability science must involve political reflexivity. Who has the power? What are they using it for? Who and what are they using it for? So does that mean necessarily that there can be no sustainability science without scholarly activism, given also that there is a very real threat caused by the co-optation of decolonization into a buzzword, which is obviously a very big concern. So yeah, how can we ensure that decolonization is not a metaphor, but rather a meaningful and transformative call to action? Thank you.
Did you want us to take turns or anyone jump in?
As you wish.
All right, well, I'll just say a couple of sentences. So I agree with that decolonization has been kind of made into a metaphor. It's been emptied and hollowed out. It's being used very problematically because the main root understanding of it has been really simplified. But I think one of the things is also that to recognize that there's no such thing as that objective science, right? That decolonizing sits in opposition to. So what are we decolonizing? And as you highlighted that when we talk about the intellectual project component, how it's also about lack of recognition of the politics and the power relations, I think what's really important to also recognize is that when we think about the kind of coloniality of Eurocentric ontologies and epistemologies that kind of went global, you know, there's all kinds of other forms of knowledge that survived, as we know, as we've talked about, as all of us have done research on. And as Cecilia said, it is about building relationships and not that extractive research. But is that relationship always activism? Because I find that, you know, as somebody who identifies as a scholar activist, there's that kind of tendency in academia, at least, to identify activists as being sitting separate from the intellectual theoretician. It's seen in this hierarchy of the person who theorizes, who thinks, you know, in the Socratic method versus the activist who's down on the road or in the streets or in the forest. And I completely reject that notion, because that is exactly how Eurocentric epistemological framing of what knowledge was perpetuated. And I think this is where, you know, feminist STS study scholars have been useful, but mostly it's been anti-colonial and indigenous scholarship in terms of how do we challenge that hierarchy between theory and praxis. What does it mean to not only do the work, but be highly reflexive of our own positionality in the research process, about those power relationships, but how things are getting framed. As soon as something is being framed as scholar activist, it often tends to lose its charm, among subconscious bias among students, administrators, academics. So it's a reframing, I think. Yeah, however we call it, I think we need to explain what it means and what the outcomes are. And I don't have a perfect solution to that, but I think it's really important to recognize that we're not always producing knowledge in a vacuum, and neither are we just doing activism devoid of knowledge production. I'll leave it at that.
Would Lyla or Bagele like to add anything more?
Bagele, you want to go? Yeah, please. I think you're on mute.
Can somebody summarize the question? I didn't quite get the question.
The question was, do you think that there can be no decolonized sustainability science without scholarly activism?
Or without activism? Okay. No, Lyla, you can go.
Okay, well, I mean, it depends what you mean by scholarly activism. I would say that we're dealing with very complex challenges in the world, and we need different types of engagement and different types of knowledge. So no one discipline can address this. So you need different perspectives. So I guess engaged scholarship is kind of activisty in a way, but obviously it doesn't mean you, and it doesn't mean you compromise on scholarly standards. Also, it depends on how you define scholarship. So a lot of knowledge that we were talking about today has not been considered knowledge, like indigenous knowledge, local people's understandings, place-based knowledge. So if it means it's activist, if I say we have to lift this kind of knowledge, fine, that's okay to me. I think it really also means acknowledging the coloniality in the sustainability science and really being very systematic about that. There's a danger to decoloniality because it's such a buzzword now and everybody's using it in a very superficial way, almost as a form of capacity building, which is really horrible, actually. So I think we really have to be also quite careful. Feminist research talks about standpoint theory, and there you actually it's very thick objectivity because you actually align with the perspectives of the marginalized or the indigenous or silenced voices. So I think in that sense we can draw inspiration from established methodologies also, I think. And it's also important to bear in mind that because of the sociology of science, we know that all forms of science are located in socio-cultural and political practice. No science is detached. So I think we really have to break this idea of this kind of uber science that is objective and then the other science that is activist or, place-based, etc. Because even physicists, their science is also located within certain practices and cultures.
Thank you. Lyla, raise your hand. Do you have a question?
Thank you, Lyla and Professor Lyla, Professor Chilisa, and Professor Farhana. This has been amazing, really stimulating. Thank you for organizing this. My question, anyone can answer. So Lyla, I agree with you that whose knowledge counts and the issue of power to define knowledge. I completely agree with that. I'm completely into decolonial camp. At the same time, I'm increasingly worried about the right-wing appropriation of the discourse of decolonization, where, for example, in India, where right-wing government is actually peddling superstition, pseudo, like if you have COVID, just drink cow urine, for example, and calling it as decolonization. And so So I think what I see is that tension between ensuring that that pseudoscience is not peddled as decolonization. So that's where I'm needing a response.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in India. I completely agree, and it's not just India. In other places also, you know, you
Yes.
can use the right can use this idea of pushing back against colonialism or colonial thought to peddle all kinds of things. We had a question in the chat about right-wing authoritarianism, so I think we just have to be very vigilant about that. And, you know, there's ways to debunk that. You know, since when can you cure COVID with cow's urine? I'm sure, you know, it's not rocket science. But yeah, you're right. It's scary and dangerous. And this peddling of also, you know, using going to the global platform to really promote very, very reactionary views. That's very dangerous.
Thank you, Lyla.
Thanks, Lyla. Maybe we can go back to the chat on some previous questions that we had. We had a question from Amitangshu about authoritarian states, if he would like to take the floor.
Yeah, I could do that. Thanks so much. This is connected to the previous question actually that was asked, and that's for all of you. Because if you're talking about decolonization, then somewhere it also kind of critiques the approaches of the state, because the state is now beholden to many of these approaches. So the question that I was posing there was, with reducing space for civil collaborations, especially India and Bangladesh at this point of time, where does one take this discourse forward? And what are the pathways? And I'd be very curious, Lyla, because when you're working on Gujarat and Bombay, you must have encountered resistance also from, from the state. So how did you negotiate that? So yeah, it's a generic question as well.
Farhana, you want to go first to Bangladesh? Or?
Oh, I thought Amit's question was directed at you in terms of resistance you face, but I'll just briefly say absolutely. These authoritarian states are appropriating these terms, and they're using it in very problematic ways. But one thing that's happening, at least in the Bangladesh context, is that repressive actions by the state to silence journalists, oppositional politicians, so that space for that kind of alliance building across difference is shrinking. But it's also a global phenomenon that we're seeing the global turn to the right, both in terms of appropriation of terms, misuse of terms, but then also carrying out various forms of silencing and repressive tactics, whether it's simple things like stopping social media during times of crisis and political instability, where social media becomes the way people communicate, to not allowing certain kinds of research to proceed through those ecologies of fear. But at the same time, I also want to stress that these alliances we talk about often assume the researchers coming from the outside. And right, so there's what about researchers that are on the ground, that are working in the community? There's that place-based knowledge that people like that, their scholarship often doesn't count. And this is what indigenous scholar who's currently based in Canada, Kim Tallbear, calls it is about standing with community instead of saving or researching on or liberating from, right? It is that kind of not externalizing it, but recognizing that communities are A, doing research, B, producing co-producing knowledge, and 3, sometimes we really need to silence ourselves and decenter ourselves in order for things to flourish. And while we're dealing with state repression, if we have different kinds of privileges, we mobilize those privileges to tackle those oppressions however we can, because there's certainly far more marginalized people than us academics.
Yeah, no, it's very eloquent. I mean, just to add, you asked me specifically, it was quite difficult in Kutch because now it's a border and the paranoia, it was very difficult to gain access, but let's not talk about ourselves. The herders cannot go to the mangrove islands. I mean, they're not allowed to go. So their access is so restricted. So what we go through as researchers, as Farhana said, doesn't really matter. And also, to echo what Farhana said, our research could only happen. It's happening together with local partners and local researchers. And it's building on very, very long durée relationships. So I've been going to Kutch since the 1990s. I've gone back to these places for a long time. Bagele, the fishers, we're working with a group that is living there in the fishing community in Bombay. So whether we go or not doesn't matter. Our local partners are there all the time. But on the other hand, yes, and those alliances are strong. So amidst all the horrible authoritarian crap that you see, there's always hope somewhere. And I think we just have to cling on to that and gain inspiration from that. But we know that, it's very, very difficult, and people are being jailed because they're Muslim, and because they're activists, and because they're intellectual, and because they're secular. That's current India for you.
Yeah. I want to say that I'm thinking that indigenous decolonization, indigenous knowledge is becoming a reality, no more a buzzword. I think a lot is happening. First of all, the United Nations has several projects on decolonization and indigenous knowledge. I know that in my country, we just finished a project where government realized the colonial aftermath, and how the cultures and some valuable indigenous knowledge was lost, and is still valuable, because even though it was not at the center, it continued to inform practice. It continued to feed the people, be it fishermen, and so on and so on. So I think academics and scholars have this way of wanting to dismiss themselves. Oh, it's a buzzword. I don't think it's a buzzword. I think it's real. I think it's on the top table. I think it's been taken seriously. On the ground, there's a lot of activism. Traditional knowledge holders are coming forward to say, we have the knowledge, we want it to go forward. So I think these are good times. These are good times. The thing is, what are the strategies in your field? For example, I am in a project on database, a peace database, a peace database based on African knowledge systems. They say that there's a database on peace, but that is based on Western ways of thinking. In reality, they're creating one that is based on African thought, African experiences, African realities. And so if we are going to have that kind of a database, I think we're moving. I don't doubt that decolonization is not making an impact. I think it is making an impact. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll go back to a previous comment from Neha about suggesting more instruments towards policy, advocacy, and praxis. Neha, would you like to take the floor? No, that's okay. Maybe I can read out the question. So they say, as someone straddling between critical scholarship and public policy space, besides writing and activism, can we suggest more instruments towards policy advocacy and praxis, such that we can bring these awareness into public policy space, which is so devoid of ethics and values grounded in the intersectional values, and is currently being advised by large consulting firms, UN bureaucracy, but not critical scholars? Would anyone like to respond to this question?
I've been chatting with Neha a bit by email. I know, is she here? I know she's been very frustrated in the big bureaucracies and UN system. So I guess it's about finding alliances and spaces within these big bureaucracies. That's possible too. It's not entirely impossible. It is frustrating. And also finding ways to challenge that kind of dominant, distant kind of perspective. So taking these stories, you know, to the bureaucracies, we found that very powerful. You know, either either it could be indigenous knowledge or the paintings or the photos, etc. That was very effective. Or even making people taking them to these distant islands or these sites, I think also is a powerful way of breaking that kind of bureaucratic distance.
Thank you.
Maybe Bagele and Farhana want to add here.
I have a problem hearing, so I didn't get the question.
The question was about suggesting more instruments towards policy advocacy and practice, given that we are, with regards to large consulting firms or UN bureaucracy, which is so devoid of ethics and values, how can we sort of go beyond that and make sure it's grounded in intersectional values?
Yeah, in Africa, we are into decolonizing, for example, the discipline of evaluation. And so African Evaluation Association is driving African-rooted evaluation. And with that, the AFRIA has come up with principles, evaluation principles that evaluators should use when they do evaluation in Africa. And these are evaluation principles that are based on African philosophies, African histories, African culture, and so on and so on. And I think that's policy. And what we are doing, what AFRIA is doing is selling these principles to governments. You remember, governments are the biggest users of evaluation, and they are receptive. They are learning. It's a learning process. The problem becomes when it's the funders who dictate which principles should inform the evaluation process. So yes, there's always that power game. But a lot is happening, at least in Africa. We want to promote our philosophies, like the philosophy of Ubuntu. We don't only want it to be used in Africa, but we want it to be adapted worldwide, just as we adapt worldviews from other countries and other regions.
Thank you. There was a question from Simone in the chat about Western science standards, if Simone wanted to take the floor. Or I can also read out the question. So the question was from Simone: how do we keep up with Western science standards of doing research when we embrace indigenous methodologies?
How do we?
How do we keep up with Western science standards of doing research when we embrace indigenous methodologies?
You see, the question is about relevance. It's like asking, how do we keep up with relevance when we have to deal with Western standards? It's all about relevant. If you are relevant to the community, then that is good research. If the standards are the standards of the communities, then that is good research. But if you impose standards that the people cannot understand, and you describe them in terms and descriptions that they cannot recognize themselves because you are using Western standards, we won't go very far. So indigenous research methodologies are just methodologies that come from within the communities. Let the West adapt indigenous research methodologies, and let's not adapt Western methodologies. Let the West adapt indigenous research methodologies. When they adapt, it means they are also coming up with some of their standards and dancing with indigenous methodologies. Let them get to the dance floor and let's see what comes out.
Thank you. We have a question from Alex Caron, if they would like to take the floor to ask their question. Okay, they can't talk, so I will read it out for them. So they are asking, modern sciences are therefore colonized as a form of modeling of the world to understand and make sense of it, and exist in parallel of other forms of knowledge production. Can we, researchers that are aware but are trained as colonized, decolonize sciences and propose a decolonized research? Or can we only make sure we understand the extent to which our research is still colonized and make sure we address this issue as much as possible and make sure we state this in our scientific production? So I think it's a...
I can take that because I sort of touched upon it and have written about this. The assumption often is that Western science is that kind of objective science, right? And everything else is subpar or inferior. And that's how Eurocentrism had to kind of internalize race science as it propagated through imperialism and colonialism. So if we think about modern science as coming out of those kinds of roots, it has carried that baggage across. So what we're trying to do right now in the last couple of decades is more disrupt that. So Bagele's point about let the West adapt to what is there before, but a lot of that has also been repressed and erased. So I think one of the things is to not only just address that part of the question where you say, yes, we recognize that the knowledge we've been taught has been colonized, that our cognitive and epistemic injustices have been perpetuated. And yes, you do acknowledge that, and that's part of that reflexivity, acknowledging your positionality in that spectrum, because knowledge is always co-produced, it is never directional. So that's part of the process. Yes, you can state that in your scientific production, acknowledge that. So that was my entire critique of the knowledge around planetary boundaries. But what we can also do is think about decentering ourselves and silencing ourselves and practice deep listening so that we're able to support and center indigenous knowledges and cosmologies and paradigms and methodologies. That is something we can do within limits of understanding our funders, funding politics. This goes to the question that Neha proposed, but also Katharina, in terms of does it start with education? And I absolutely agree. We need to start to decolonize cognitive justice in the classrooms, because what we teach becomes practice. So this is something I've been saying for many, many years, that yes, it is in the settler colonial context, such as the US and Canada and Palestine, it is about land back. That is the first instantiation, but it is also about what happens thereafter. It is about teachings of what is science, what, our pedagogies. So this is where we have to draw from scholars outside of sustainability. So anti-colonial scholars like Frantz Fanon, or Black feminist scholars like Bell Hooks, and so on. And because they help us think through what we need to undo so that we can do things better. And this is where a lot of indigenous scholars like Kyle White or Kim Tallbear or Zoe Todd, but then also indigenous scholars from Asia, Latin, and Africa who are not as well recognized and published in the Western Academy. So I've said a lot of things, and these I have written about them. So you're welcome to go to my website, download my publications, and read better elaborations of me condensing this, but I did want to acknowledge that, yes, we need to first acknowledge and then do something about it. It is a question of what it is that we do.
Lyla, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I think it was very eloquently said. I mean, for one, I guess a lot of scientists, physical scientists, are really realizing the limits to modeling, because modeling is a very reductionist exercise, though it is supposed to be very high science, but in reality, it really is so reductionist that you don't capture everything. So there's greater acknowledgement about the need that we need knowledge pluralism. And that means drawing on not social science, but even indigenous science, indigenous knowledge, etc. So the best research now on trying to understand climate change is happening when scientists co-produce with indigenous people, with local scholars, etc. You know, how do you understand what's happening to ice and the glaciers, etc.? You do it through, you know, different perspectives and learning. So I think humility on the part of scientists and also opening up. And as I said earlier, I've written about this too in this when we were looking at climate change and uncertainty and how it's conceptualized from the top or bottom, below, etc. And you know, basically how we hybridize that. And we have to move away from this idea that there's one knowledge that is superior or one knowledge that is detached and the others are local. I mean, no knowledge is really detached. All knowledge is grounded. All knowledge is locally produced, is culturally produced, and is political.
Kenneth, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I have, I don't know if I should classify it as a follow-up or maybe as a comment, but what I know is that it matches with what Prof. Sultana and Prof. Mehta were just saying a couple of minutes ago, especially in terms of decentering what has come to be perceived as Western knowledge. Because I think that there is one thing to foreground non-Western knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems, etc. But I think it is also very important to start deconstructing even the so-called Western knowledge, because I think Western knowledge in itself is more or less of something that doesn't exist. What I mean is that we can start questioning even the provenance of what is called Western knowledge today, because it is very hybrid in nature. And by the hybridity, I mean it has what is pushed to places as maybe Euro-American knowledge often is something that is constructed from field trips and data collected from other places, not even to mention the fact that, for example, Arabic culture contributed enormously to mathematical sciences, and that also if we take even taxonomy and biology and naming of plants and classifying them, we would see that, of course, indigenous people and local people contributed to that in many ways, either maybe as working as guides or even telling so-called Western scientists about the behavioral patterns of organisms that are in quotes discovered in their localities. So I think that it would be, for me, it is important to bring to the fore non-Western epistemological systems, but at the same time also insist and point to the fact that what is marketed as Western knowledge is not purely some kind of Western knowledge. And again, that will help in, of course, decentering it and also leveling the field and making all knowledge systems stand on the same podium. And then, of course, maybe going back now to the dance metaphor that Prof. Chilisa was using, and so that they can be dancing as equal partners on the floor of knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenneth. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. If anybody would like to write them in the chat or take the floor, please feel free. So we have a question from Paloma. Many Western universities, Scandinavian most likely, and even those that have post-colonial studies are still gatekeeping. How can we take action? What can we do as a collective and as individuals? Would any of our speakers like to respond?
What was the question again?
I think Paloma is asking, how can we take action within Western universities, and what can we do as a collective rather than as individuals?
Oh, well, I think the important thing that, and I've kind of gone on about this, is you have to challenge that hierarchy at all places, at all scales. But you can't really do that until you've self-educated. If no one's teaching you, you must do that broad and deep reading and that learning, so that you are, armed with those kinds of epistemological and methodological nuances, so that you don't just show up and say, well, let's just change this, but change this how and to what. And recognize that none of this is individual. No one person can do this. It requires a group. There has to be some sort of collectivity built, right? So of course there are individual frustrations. And I think we've identified this, that it is individual, but individuals make up collectives, and collectives get things done unless you're a very charismatic individual and with a lot of power, which is not always the case for academics and students. So I think the discursive turn towards post-colonial studies and decolonial whatnot, sure, that's great. As Cecilia said, yes, if that creates space for these multiple dancings and approaches to be elevated, it's forced that space to open up because of the scholarly critique, right, that has been brought into Western or Eurocentric knowledge centers. But at the same time, recognize that it is not a one-off. It is not a one thing. It is not an event, but it is a process. And it has to keep continuing, because there's very strong forces that would like to get it to revert back. I mean, in America, where I'm situated right now, I mean, race science is coming back big time. The whole knowledge around, who is superior, inferior has had great foundational support since the Trump era. And yet this was all challenged and, kind of discarded. It seemed that way before. So, that means that this is continual, act of pushing against not just gatekeeping, but then also co-optation of what knowledge counts and what should be taught. So the curriculum, get hold of the curriculum.
Thank you. Does Lyla or Bagele have any comments on that?
I guess to add what Farhana said, it still is an unequal system, because a university in Scandinavia has probably more clout than some other universities situated in some parts of Asia or Latin America. So I think we have to challenge that. So maybe it's for future Earth to change funding structures, or because, all where does the funding go? And also, we're all dependent on this funding too. I mean, I'm sitting here in a wonderful institution, but we are very reliant. We have no core funding. So, that shapes agendas. So I guess there's some kind of knowledge production, political economy questions that also need to be addressed, not just obviously self-education is really important, but there are some of these wider structures also that are very colonial, one way, and unequal. So.
Thank you. And yeah, I agree. It is very difficult. There's no singular arrival entry point towards imagining or reimagining pathways towards this process. On that note, I think I might hand it back to Gilles, because we might have run out of time.
Yeah, I guess we always run out of time when we engage in such rich and dense topics. So it's unfortunately already time for us to conclude today's session, but really apologies to all the questions in the chat that are left unanswered. But I saw that there was a lot of discussion going on in parallel to what was going on orally on Zoom in the chat, which is great. Thank you to everyone for making this session really inspiring, thought-provoking, and stimulating. Of course, a special thanks to our speakers today, Bagele, Lyla, and Farhana. Thanks a lot. If you found this session interesting and would like to go further on the topic of decolonizing sustainability research, we also have compiled a reading list together with our speakers today, and we will be sharing this reading list in the chat in just a few seconds. And also, this webinar is the first of other webinars that we plan to organize next year around the topic of decolonizing research practices in sustainability science. And on that note, if you'd like to stay tuned for more information on our next events, I encourage you to subscribe to our Pathways newsletter. You can also follow us on LinkedIn or Mastodon, and I think Natalie is providing the links to all of these in the chat box. And lastly, if you would like to watch the recording of this session, if you would like to share it with other people who you think would find it interesting, and if you would like to watch our previous webinars, you can visit our YouTube channel or Pathways webpage, where our previous webinars are listed. So with this, I want to conclude by thanking you all once again. Thank you, Bagele. Thank you, Lyla. Thank you, Farhana. Thank you, Stephanie, also for co-hosting the session with me. And thank you to all of you who participated, who contributed thoughts, insights, questions. It's a great place to be in, this Pathways Forum. We can see so many perspectives coming together, and it's all thanks to you. Well, we hope to see you next time, either in person or online, for another Pathways Initiative related event or another kind of event. And until then, please take care.